I am Flavia Zimmerman from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Patrick Cademus. Patrick Cademus is the former French consul in Perth, and we are going to be discussing the French elections and the current political environment in France. Thank you for being with us, Patrick.
My pleasure.
Patrick, in your opinion, what are the main political forces in Europe and how it is triggering the far-right rise, not only in Europe but in France as well?
Sure. Look, the way I see it is really a combination of a number of different factors. Probably the deepest one, I think, is the economic malaise in Europe. Following the crisis that the whole world, except to some extent Australia, has had almost a decade ago, the economic situation has been quite bad, to say the least, in some countries. And certainly, in the case of France, it hasn't been very bright either. So a number of people feel that politics, the way they know it, has not really served their economical interests. Unemployment, of course, is still around 10%. The other factor, of course, which is linked a little bit to the first one, is that the Hollande presidency, to a large extent, has failed to deliver in terms of improving the economical situation, and especially on the job front. So those factors, I think, have had quite a substantial impact. The other one, of course, is the migration crisis, to some extent, that has come on top, of course, of this environment, and where people feel that they are a bit besieged, if I can say, and because of that, it's contributing to a sentiment where people feel that politics, the way they know it, is not really serving them anymore. So you have seen that in the UK, in the Brexit referendum, you certainly had a strong factor, which was this fear of the migrants in general. It featured also quite highly in the campaign that you had recently in the Netherlands. It is certainly the case in France as well. So all those factors, I think, are combining to create a sentiment where people need a change, where they feel that politics, the way they know it, is no longer serving them.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And in your opinion, how the rise of Marine Le Pen and the far-right movement in France might change the political landscape in France and French society?
Sure. Look, I would probably start by answering your question by saying that people probably exaggerate a little bit the Le Pen factor. French elections are quite specific in the sense that you have really two rounds. You have a first round where someone might actually arrive first, but that doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't mean usually, that they will become the leader of the government or the president, or that they will eventually be elected. There is then a second round, is a runoff, where the two first candidates, of course, face each other. And generally speaking, most polls, actually all polls, show that whatever the position that Marine Le Pen achieves in the first role, she has virtually no chance of becoming president of France. So it's important to put things in context again, because people tend to exaggerate. They almost sometimes hyperventilate about what would happen if Marine Le Pen was to become the president of France. And it's important to explain that this is actually quite an unlikely scenario. Of course, one has to envisage what that could mean, but it's difficult because her policies are quite contradictory. Some of her policies quite clearly contradict some other policies that she has or may have, and because of that, to be quite pragmatic about what it could mean, it's relatively difficult. Some of them are probably unenforceable. Some of them could be enforced, but they would conflict almost directly with some other priorities that she has. So it's difficult really to be able to tell what that could mean to some extent, France would be in the situation where people found themselves in the US with the Trump election, where people hear him talk about a certain policy and then confronted with reality, it quickly becomes something else, or he, switches positions. So I think that's where the factor, I believe, initially is a bit exaggerated. And secondly, even if it were to materialize, difficult really to assess in terms of what it would mean. I think Le Pen and the National Front, like a number of populist movements around the world, like a number of far-right or far-left movements around the world, are much more geared to challenge the incumbents, which tend to be center-left or center-right governments, but do not necessarily have policies that are intended to actually run the country. I think that's very much, in my opinion at least, what I believe we would be faced with Marine Le Pen. A number of economists have also published, I think today, 25 of them. They were all winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics. They have all mentioned that in reality the positions that she has and the positions that she could potentially be having as a president could be dangerous, of course, and outright unenforceable.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And just reflecting a little bit more on Marine Le Pen's rhetoric, even though the possibilities that she would be elected are still not very substantial, taking into account recent statements made by Nicolas Sarkozy and his intentions to create a ministry of immigration and French identity. To which extent do you think Marine Le Pen's rhetoric might be impacting the current political dialogue in France?
Look, I think in a number of ways. I mean, that links to a number of different themes. First of all, as we mentioned before, you have today a refugee crisis. You have a sentiment that people are immediately being impacted in their jobs, in their economical well-being by the fact that foreigners are coming to the country. They see images on TV almost every night of boatloads of refugees arriving into Europe. So that's certainly something that plays to the far right, in this case with Marine Le Pen, and we're going back to an idea of the French first, the jobs to the French, appeals a lot to a number of people. So when people like Nicolas Sarkozy, that represents the center-right, are confronted with a situation where simple solutions are proposed for complex realities, and especially pushed by people like Marine Le Pen, he has to some extent to counter that message by a certain proposition that will prevent some of his electors from going outright to the far right. So he is pushed, if I can say, to the right by the fact that Marine Le Pen and her rhetoric is very much centered around those themes. At the same time, you have, politics taking place in some other countries as well. So the fact that, for example, in the US, the fact that in the UK, the fact that in a number of European countries, including Germany, that opened itself quite widely to migrants, you had quite a pushback after a while where, Merkel, for example, had to backpedal and almost apologize in relation to that, creates a context where people have to be quite careful to not only not appear as being pro-migrant, but also to be staunchly identified as defending the national identity and catering to those of their voters who could be tempted by the extremes. So I see it, to be honest, more as a defensive way of reoccupying some of the field, if I can say, that otherwise would be left to the extremes.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And in your opinion, which might be the main political reasons for Nicolas Sarkozy to pull out his presence in the presidential race?
Do you mean that he actually did not manage to make it
Yes.
as the candidate
Yes.
of the center right?
Yes.
Look, I think it's a general disillusionment, if I can say, with politics the way people know it. So people were quite disillusioned by the Hollande presidency. So François Hollande is the first president in the Fifth Republic not to actually represent himself. He knew he would probably not go very far with that. At the same time, there's a lot of disillusionment in the opinion about also the former president, who is Nicolas Sarkozy. So he actually ended up doing less well than both the former prime ministers who were competing with him in the primary for the center-right, both Juppé and Fillon. So it's Juppé and Fillon that made it to the second round of the primary. Sarkozy was third. So I think he wanted to be, I think, a new Napoleon, if I can say, coming back to save or to rescue France. I think the opinion today certainly is much more in favor of a renewal. If we look at the top 4 candidates today, maybe 5 or 6 days from the first round, 3 out of 4 are outsiders. The only one who is a mainstream, if I can say, candidate is François Fillon, who ended up winning the primary on the center-right. All the others are candidates that represent either outsiders or extremes. Marine Le Pen, we mentioned her quite extensively. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which has been a major phenomenon of this campaign, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And of course, Emmanuel Macron, who's today neck and neck with Marine Le Pen. So it's quite unusual for France to have a situation where the candidate from the center-left is not in the top 4 candidates and has virtually no chance of making it to the runoff, and where the only candidate representing the traditional parties is François Fillon, and as we speak, he's only potentially third, so wouldn't even make it to the runoff. Emmanuel Macron is probably the main phenomenon of this campaign. Marine Le Pen, we got quite used to her and to her father, so the Le Pen family is not new in French politics. But certainly the configuration that I'm mentioning, where 3 out of 4 are very new or outsiders to French politics, this is completely unheard of. In such a context, both Hollande and Sarkozy had very, very, meager chances of convincing the electorate.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Very interesting talking to you.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you very
My pleasure.
much.
Thank you for having me.
And for more information, please visit our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.